guys, we're back for some more sewing talk. This time we're going to talk about gathering materials for starting a sewing project. So, fabrics. Obviously different fabrics are going to give you different kinds of looks, but the other thing with different fabrics is that they're going to behave differently and you'll need to handle them differently to be able to use them in construction. Satin is generally the most difficult fabric to work with. It's really slippery, so it doesn't like to stay still when you try to pin it or when you try to press it, and when you've got it in multiple layers it'll slide against each other and can get out of line even with pins in it, so you need to use a lot of pins for it, but you don't want to use so many that you risk snagging it. The other problem with satin is it stretches in some directions but not in others, so if you're especially going around a curve you can end up with things getting offset even with pins just because it will pull differently. So that's something you have to be really careful of and really aware of when you're working with satin. The other thing about satin and other delicate fabrics is that you have to actually use a special kind of needle on your sewing machine so that way you don't ruin the fabric. You need something that's thin so that way you don't punch large holes in between the weave of it and make it so that way the threads just rip out. Other fabrics can have some of these characteristics, or if you're really lucky, none of them, and it can affect how you're supposed to do things. Satin's kind of the catch-all that has almost every terrible characteristic in it, so that's the one to be careful of, but other fabrics will kind of behave in weird ways too, and it's something you kind of learn as you go, and it's really easy to tell when you touch it and kind of pull on it in different directions and say, okay, does it stretch this way, does it stretch that way, no, okay, we're good there. Is it shiny, is it slippery? It'll all affect how you need to handle things. Cottons are the easiest to work with. They don't tend to really stretch in one direction over another. They're very forgiving, so if you have to rip out seams because you messed up somewhere, it usually kind of self-heals and you can't really tell that there used to be stitches there. They iron well, they cut easily, they don't tend to fray all that terribly, so when you wash it ahead of time you don't have to worry about losing a bunch of fabric to fray. Stretch fabrics work well when you're winging it and not using a pattern, because if you happen to cut something a little small, you can still put it on, and it's usually not all that big of a deal. If you're using a stretch fabric and it being tight is an issue for the look you're going for, you probably shouldn't have been using a stretch fabric to begin with. Stretch fabrics like stretch twills are really easy to work with because they have the forgiving characteristics of cotton, but they have the added bonus of stretching, so you don't have to be as exact with some of your lines. If you've got a stretch fabric like spandex, that's shiny, and so then you've got your issues that I mentioned with satin, where you have to be careful how you pin it so that way you don't snag it and that you don't end up with the layers slipping against each other so they actually still line up the way they're supposed to. When working with a stretch fabric, what I like to do to really lock it into place is to go back over the seam, not like over the seam itself, but the pieces of fabric that are sticking out of the seam, and zigzag stitch those together. That helps lock them in place. So that way then if you have a thread that breaks at some point, or maybe it was close to the edge and tries to pull through, you've got other stitches to lock it in place. Sheer fabrics like organza or lace are not very forgiving, and you can easily have the issue where you have essentially holes punched through the fabric rather than a needle going between the weave. So those will also need the same kind of special care that I said satin does, where you need to make sure you have the special needle type. When you're choosing a fabric for your project, you want to consider both the look you're going for and your skill level. You don't want to choose a fabric that's beyond what you can reasonably manage, like satin. I still don't like to use satin. But you also don't want to sacrifice the look of whatever you're putting together. I mean, the look is part of why you're making it instead of just going and buying it somewhere. So what's the point if you're making it look different just because you can't handle the fabric? The back of the pattern will tell you how much fabric you need for your project. I usually get a little bit more than it recommends, but that's just me, you don't have to, but don't try to get away with less. Please don't do that. If a pattern gives you size options, you need to pick the size first, because it'll actually tell you how much fabric you need based on what size it is you're making of whatever it is. Always pick the size for the largest dimension. It'll have hip, waist, and bust measurements on it, and then have a size scale according to that. Always pick whatever fits the largest dimension. I am always in 3 different sizes. My hips never match my waist and never match my bust. It kind of sucks to have to take it in everywhere else, but it's a lot easier to take stuff in than it is to try to let it out. The back of the pattern also tells you other kind of notions you need, like zippers, buttons, webbing, and so on. Buttons are pretty obvious. I'm not going to bother talking about those until we get to a point where we're sewing them. When a project needs a zipper, you can pretty much use any kind of zipper you want. If you try to use an invisible zipper, there's actually a special zipper foot that you need to get for your sewing machine. You can't just use your regular zipper foot. They're usually by the invisible zippers. It's this little plastic thing you throw on there. It's not a big deal. So you can choose whatever style you want or works for you, but make sure you get the right length. And when I say get the right length, never get one that's too short. You can always get one that's too long. There's actually ways to shorten a zipper, but you can't really lengthen a zipper. So get either what it asks for or something that's a little bit longer. When you're making an accessory, the pattern might ask for webbing. That's the technical name for the stuff that backpack straps are made out of. There's nylon versions and there's cotton versions. What one you use kind of depends on what you can find and what you want things to look like in the end. The cotton ones are really thick, so they're kind of hard to sew in, but they lock in really easily. The nylon ones are really thin and they kind of have a cool sheen to them, but you have to be careful how you put them in because those can pull the same way that satin does and stitches can pull right through it. There's ways to seal them, and I can show you that sometime, but it's just something you need to know about ahead of time instead of trying to stitch it in and then realize it just keeps pulling out. Interfacing is stuff that will add a little bit of extra durability and stiffness to fabric. You'll see it in accessories to help hold them up, and you'll see it in clothing sometimes, especially around collars. There are two types, there's sew-in and there's fusible, and then both of those come in a variety of different weights. Which weight you use will depend on what level of stability and stiffness that you want out of your fabric. Obviously, things that are labeled extra light or featherweight aren't going to give you a ton of extra support, but may be good for delicate fabrics that tend to pull apart easily. Things that are heavyweight give you a lot of extra stiffness, but again, they're harder to use because they're thicker. The pattern will probably tell you what weight you need, but if it doesn't, then just kind of use your imagination. If it's something that you expect to be really thick or very structured, use a thicker one. If it's something you think it might just be a stability issue and it's not necessarily a structure issue, use a lighter weight one. Whether you choose fusible or sew-in is completely up to you. It might specify on the pattern, but really they're both going to work the same way in most cases. I always choose fusible just because I don't like trying to keep pieces together while I'm sewing and like keeping things pinned. I figure it's one more layer I can take out. Fusible works by just applying it to the back of your fabric and using an iron and the steam setting, and it has little glue beads on it and it just melts and fuses against it. And then you actually iron it on with another piece of cloth in between the iron and the interfacing, so that way it really fuses and then it's all set. Sew-in, you don't have to do that extra step, you just cut it and go like you would with any other piece of fabric, but you also have the added bonus of having to make sure it stays in line. If the pattern asks for padding but isn't any more specific than that, it means it's a hidden layer and you can use pretty much whatever you want. I tend to use fleece for padding because I can get remnants of it for pretty cheap and it adds a really nice kind of fluffiness to the project. If the pattern asks for batting, that's actually something different. That's something very specific, usually used in quilts. I don't know why you would have a random pattern that would ask for batting when it's not a quilt, but it might do that, and that will be with the rest of the quilting supplies and stuffing and things like that. So as an example, here's the back of the pattern that I use for my backpacks. On the left is English and on the right is something that's not English. So you get to completely ignore half the back. We're already through half the battle. At the top, you'll see fabrics. That section is all those recommended fabrics I was talking about before. These are all just recommendations and what this pattern is built for. You can technically use whatever you want. You just might have other considerations that you have to keep in mind for it. The next section is notions. So obviously, since it's thread, you always need thread. Your material's not going to just like magically fuse together. Now you see it says A and B, colon, and then it lists some stuff, and it says C and D. This envelope actually has multiple different patterns in it, and so you only need some notions for some of the patterns and different notions for the other patterns. The bag I use is AB, so I'm only looking at that section of notions. So I need to get 2 different size zippers and parachute clips. It says look for simplicity notions and rights trims. That's just because those are their affiliated companies. You can use whatever the hell you want. They just have to say it because it's their stuff. So moving down, we go to the AB bag. That's the bag I've done. So the rest of everything on this page is all for the other patterns that are in this envelope. So I get to ignore all of that. So really out of the back of this pattern, I'm only using 1/4 of what's back here. See, I told you it was not as bad as it looked. You'll see it says 5/8 of a yard of 45 inches. On your bolts of fabric, you can actually have different widths of fabric. So this is assuming I find a 45-inch bolt, and so I only need 5/8 of a yard of that. If you get something that's shorter than 45 inches, you'll need to get more fabric. If you get something that's longer, you can get away with less. This bag is a contrast option. It's got a band across the front. I always just leave the same color fabric, so I get to ignore that part. Lining is just whatever fabric. This is the backpack again. This is going to be what's on the inside pocket. If you've got a lining fabric for something like a dress, that's going to be something that you might only see little bits of, like on the underside of the skirt. So you can kind of make that a little bit of whatever you want. It's just make sure that your seams don't protrude funny and don't like make you itch because they're against your skin. So you can see here I've got padding. It actually says fleece next to it, which is nice and helpful because the first time I looked at this, I probably wouldn't have known what it meant by padding. So interfacing here, it actually does say fusible. It's one of those things that sometimes it'll tell you, sometimes it won't. You can really do whatever you want. Even if it had told me to use sew-in, I was going to use fusible anyways, but it does tell me what weight it wants, which is really important. The ribbon, in this case, that was optional. It should actually say optional next to it. I don't know why it doesn't. And then webbing, that was the strapping for the backpack. So you see, it tells you everything you need, what sizes you need of it, what lengths of it you need, for what size bolts, and it really covers all the bases. So if you follow everything that's on the back of this for whatever pattern you've chosen, you should really be all set for everything that you might need once you open the envelope and get cracking. In the next video, I'll talk about a fabric I actually intentionally skipped on this round. around. It's something that's really useful for doing test pieces. You might want to do a test piece if you're doing something that's really complicated, or you're about to use a fabric that's really expensive and you can't really afford to get more of it if you make a mistake. So it's something I always have a stock of, and I'll talk in the next video about how fantastic it is and what you can do with it. Hopefully soon we'll be able to start on the actual project I told you about, and I can walk you through how to do that. In the meantime, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll catch you guys later.